Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Dane Menke. I am the Digital Marketing Manager here at REGENESIS and Land Science. Before we get started, I have just a few administrative items to cover. Since we're trying to keep this under an hour, today's presentation will be conducted with the audience audio settings on mute. This will minimize unwanted background noise from the large number of participants joining us today. If the webinar or audio quality degrades, please disconnect and repeat the original login steps to rejoin the webcast. If you have a question, we encourage you to ask it using the question feature located on the webinar panel. We'll collect your questions and do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. If we don't address your question within the time permitting, we'll make an effort to follow up with you after the webinar. We are recording this webinar, and a link to the recording will be emailed to you once it is available. In order to continue to sponsor events that are of value and worthy of your time, we will be sending out a brief survey following the webinar to get your feedback. Today's presentation will focus on case studies and practical strategies for remediation success with PlumeStop and AquaZVI. With that, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. We are pleased to have with us Matt Burns, Technical Fellow and the U.S. Contaminated Land National Service Line Director at WSP. Matt has more than 25 years of professional chemistry and engineering experience. He is based in Boston and is responsible for the financial and technical depth and breadth of the Contaminated Land Site Investigation and Remediation Service Line. Matt also brings chemical and microbial process expertise to assist local WSP teams with challenging investigation and remediation projects in the U.S. and across the globe. His area of expertise includes practical application of microbial and chemistry-based innovative remediation. We are also pleased to have with us today Maureen Dooley, Director of Strategic Projects at REGENESIS. Maureen has more than 25 years of experience in the remediation industry. In her current role at REGENESIS, she provides technical leadership for complex soil and groundwater remediation projects throughout North America, as well as remediation design, strategy, and business development in the northeastern United States and eastern Canada. All right, that concludes our introduction, so now I'll hand things over to Maureen to get us started.
Well, thank you, Dane, and welcome everyone. Welcome from the WSP office in beautiful downtown Boston. I understand how busy people are, so really appreciate you choosing to participate in the webinar presentation today. I want to give a special shout out to the folks in the UK and Europe who are joining us as well, as we know how late it is in your day. So the title of today's presentation is Practical Strategies to Demonstrate Remediation Success with PlumeStop and AquaZVI. And as Dane had mentioned, we are really pleased to have Matt Burns with us today to make this presentation. I have had the pleasure of working with Matt for many years, and when it comes to site remediation, I really appreciate his abilities, and he has a particularly an academic level of understanding, yet he applies this knowledge in a practical way that really can result in an effective application of technologies and ultimately achieve that goal of obtaining reduced cost to closure. So just to briefly highlight what will be covered today, Matt will discuss in some detail ways to monitor and to demonstrate biodegradation and how biodegradation is contributing to reductions observed when using PlumeStop liquid activated carbon. He also will present data from a very interesting case study, and then later in the presentation we will discuss how and why ZVI may be incorporated into a PlumeStop liquid activated carbon application. So with that, Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Maureen. That was a great introduction. I think some of my family might disagree with that, but thank you. Well, welcome to the webinar, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to tune in. As Maureen just discussed, we're going to talk about a new class of in situ remediation amendments based on the PlumeStop technology. We'll discuss some of the benefits of the technology, and we'll also discuss some of the challenges. Hopefully, we'll leave you with solutions to these challenges so that its benefits are best realized and more contaminated groundwater sites get closed. This flowchart shows the steps for managing any project, from grocery shopping to designing in situ remediation cleanups. I know this cycle is absolutely correct because I got it from Wikipedia. Let's focus on the very beginning of the project, the initiation phase. From the design engineer's perspective, that means that most of the time, a good amount of the characterization data has already been collected. And a general conceptual model has been developed. The contaminants are known. And the need for treatment has been identified. The remedial action goals have usually been set, treat to a standard or isolated pathway. So we can begin thinking about potential remediation options just about as soon as the design engineer gets the project. For in situ remediation of groundwater, there are lots of options or potential degradation pathways to stimulate. This screenshot alone shows many discrete pathways for chlorinated solvents and petroleum compounds. There are oxidative pathways, direct chemical oxidation, aerobic biooxidation, anaerobic biooxidation, co-metabolic, and reductive pathways, direct chemical reduction, hydrogenolysis, elimination pathways. And this is just the first part of the page of a simple Google search, on contaminated degradation pathways. So over the past few years, a lot of degradation pathways have been identified for design engineers to stimulate. Further, there are lots of combinations of these pathways that can be used to make cleanup even more efficient. Here's a little bit more info about combined remedies. Combining remedies is often referred to as treatment trains. The concept has been around for a while with pump and treat systems. For example, the first, you extract the water and run it through an air stripper, then run it through activated carbon for polishing. So the idea behind combined remedies is that each technology has a set of optimum conditions where they perform most efficiently. The plot here shows increasing contaminant concentration on the x-axis and increasing cost in dollars per mass and contaminant removed on the y-axis. The black line shows that mass removal, generally through horsepower technologies, is most efficient at high contaminant concentrations. Bioremediation is more efficient at the lower contaminant concentrations. ISCO and ISCR fill the space between mass removal and bioremediation. Combining our remedies allows for the highest treatment efficiency at the lowest possible cost. I love combined remedies. Nearly all of my projects now use combined remedies. My favorite combined remedies involve stimulating multiple in situ degradation pathways using a single amendment formulation. Jim Cummings and his colleagues at EPA have championed the use of combined remedies. He aptly calls these multi-component amendment formulation twofers. You'd be surprised at how many different degradation pathways can be combined synergistically. 3-fers and 4-fers, maybe even more. And the best part about these applications is they lead to complete remediation and lower costs to closure. I'll be talking about a couple of amendment formulation combinations today: PlumeStop plus Bio and PlumeStop plus Bio plus ZVI. Additional information on multi-component, multifunctional amendment synergies can be found in the Combined Remedies article, Thinking Out the Side of the Boxcar, which we published last year. So the end game is that in addition to selecting degradation mode, oxidation or reduction, there are many degradation pathways that can be used and probably hundreds of pathway combinations. In every amendment vendor, they'll claim that they have the best, their product, their stimulant is the best for your site. And if the contaminated matrix was homogeneous sand, well, they might be right. Their product might be magic dust. But the most challenging part of any in situ design is not whether a pathway or pathways can be stimulated. It's whether or not that's relatively easy to prove by doing some advanced diagnostics combined with some in situ or ex situ studies. I find the most challenging aspect of the design to be making contaminant amendment contact, actually getting on the degradation pathway. So here's the reality of most sites. The image to the right is a televiewer log of fractured bedrock. It's a 360-degree photo of the borehole. You can see some wide fractures here, and you'll be seeing this bedrock again in a few minutes in the case study. This is a 3-foot section of that televiewer image. You can see the fractures here with apertures ranging from 6 inches to 1/4 inch and even smaller. The bulk matrix is sandstone, which has a fairly high porosity as bedrock goes, and is compared to the porosity of fractures. You can see that there's going to be quite a difference in how contaminated groundwater moves within the fractures versus within the competent rock matrix. The difference is going to lead to back diffusion. There are some visuals that explain this in the next couple of slides, but basically back diffusion can occur with as little as an order of magnitude difference in hydraulic conductivity between adjacent matrices. So a sandy zone adjacent to a less transmissive zone is equivalent or near equivalent to this bedrock example. So contaminated groundwater flows fast through fractures. This is vector transport. But affected groundwater also migrates into less transmissive zones, here into the bulk sandstone by diffusion. This slide shows a remedial effort, which cleaned up the more transitive flow zones. The remediation changes the diffusion gradient, and contaminants diffuse from the bulk sandstone and, if the amendment is no longer there, recontaminates the higher flow zone, causing a contaminant concentration rebound in the more transmissive zone. This back diffusion will occur for at least as long as the contaminant has been present, probably much longer. Here's another cleanup attempt, but this time with a longer lasting amendment. The longer lasting amendments are typically limited to colloidal particles. But as I mentioned earlier, colloidal particles are difficult to deliver in fractured rock without potentially clogging fractures and diverting flow. This dramatically limits the options available to the design engineer. The product innovators at REGENESIS have developed a technology that aids in the distribution of these colloidal particles. They use an anionic polymer to sterically stabilize small particles within aqueous solutions so that they flow like water. And the delivery characteristics are more comparable to amendments that dissolve than conventionally applied colloidal solid amendments. The column test, this column test, it shows the difference in transport characteristics between the sterically stabilized and non-stabilized particles. You'll see there's quite a difference. You can see from the labels on the sides that the particles being tested were activated carbon-based PlumeStop, which is the first material REGENESIS has applied the stabilization technology to. And that's compared against powder-activated carbon. I've used it on several sites, and it functions differently than any other in situ amendment I've used. This is because PlumeStop alone does not destroy contaminants. It absorbs them. Destruction is completed by a co-application of a combined remedy that stimulates degradation along one of those pathways shown in the earlier Google search slide. The PlumeStop concentrates the chemicals for efficient treatment along these pathways. And if you'd like more information on how the activated carbon enhances biodegradation, there is a great webinar that Dora Taggart of Microbial Insights gave, archived on the REGENESIS website. Let's use a visual to explain the significance of this sorption mechanism. All right, here's a glass of water. And if we install a well, I should have put the sand in first. And then we'll add a contaminant. And our contaminant is conveniently colored red. And we treat it with PlumeStop and biostimulants. We can wait a while for the PlumeStop to settle out of solution, or a cationic parking agent can be added to cancel out the negative charge of the PlumeStop's steric stabilization polymer to speed things up. you end up with an aqueous phase free or nearly free of contaminants. This is because the contaminants partitioned to the soil phase and is hopefully degrading. Why is it important that the contaminant is degrading on the PlumeStop in the solid phase? After all, following the treatment, the activated carbon in the groundwater concentration is likely an order of magnitude lower. So treatment with the activated carbon causes dramatic concentration decreases, and oftentimes it's pretty close, if not complying with applicable standards in the aqueous phase. Well, it's important to add the degradation mechanism too, because activated carbon has limited absorptive capacity. Room needs to be made on the activated carbon by destructive treatment to accommodate additional contaminant loading from, for example, back diffusion. Or even naturally occurring organic materials. These materials can migrate onto the treatment zone, into the treatment zone, and potentially bump off a contaminant. Here's an older but applicable guidance on activated carbon. On the second page, it notes that high levels of organic matter may result in rapid exhaustion of the carbon. It's pretty easy to imagine a scenario where background levels of organic carbon, even those lower than the 10 milligrams per liter noted here, when continuously loaded, could cause an issue, potentially leading to desorption of the target contaminants in the future. So it is very important to have a destructive mechanism included to make sure the remediation is complete and that there are no surprises a couple of years down the road. So monitoring to assess degradation along the stimulated pathways is very important too. Let's go back to the project management cycle to show the importance of performance monitoring of any remediation project. Again, this flow chart shows steps for managing any project, grocery shopping to brain surgery, and even including remediation. After initiation, all projects go through a planning stage where remedial action objectives are set. In our case, combined remedy of bioremediation aided by sorption onto activated carbon. After the plan and design are implemented, testing can begin to see if the remedial action objectives have been met. If the test is passed, the project closes. But if it fails, then you basically need to go back to the planning and design phase and come up with an adjustment or start all over. This can become an endless iterative cycle. The way to break the cycle is to make sure that the degradation pathway or pathways for combined remedies that you're trying to engineer are actually stimulated and the degradation pathway is complete. If a problem is identified early, then you'll be able to fix it quicker and minimize your trips around the project management cycle and close the project quickly and permanently. I think of these degradation pathways the same as taking a trip in an unfamiliar area before GPS. After every turn, I used to look for visual clues, landscape features, signs that indicate that I was on the right road. Observing these cues are the tests used along the trip to my destination. If I looked for the signs at key points, frequently the consequence of making a wrong turn would never be that bad. I could just turn around and get back on the right path. If I didn't look for signs often enough, I could end up way off course and maybe not even reach my destination. The degradation pathway or pathways in the case of combined remedies is the remediation roadmap. The specific reactants and products and the number of reactants and products in the equation vary, but the contaminant being treated and the pathway being stimulated cause them to vary. But there's always products and reactants. Key reactants and products, anything needed to facilitate the reaction, are great candidates to include in performance monitoring plans. The performance monitoring plans do not need to mirror natural attenuation investigations. For M&A investigations, the degradation pathway is unknown and needs to be identified, and the stoichiometry of the equation of that degradation pathway needs to be figured out. In the presence of enough reactants and proper conditions to derive complete degradation all need to be determined for M&A to be applicable. At bioremediation sites, The design engineer selects the pathway to stimulate and provides the proper conditions. Careful considerations given to the amount of reactants, the macronutrients, the macronutrients, the electron acceptors and electron donors needed to drive the reactions. So performance monitoring is a design verification at the working level. Are there any issues needed to be fixed level? So observing expected trends is evidence of activity along the targeted degradation pathway and the evidence that you're realizing your design goals. But not all data is equal. Data that provide direct evidence of degradation is the strongest. And if decreasing VOC concentrations are the king of that evidence line. After all, VOCs are the reason remediation is needed and degradation pathways are identified for stimulation. End products like ethane and ethene for chlorinated contaminants and isotopic data also provide great direct evidence of activity along stimulated degradation pathways. Mechanistic data provides solid evidence of activity along a degradation pathway too. These data focus on the facilitators of the reaction, the microbes, and the functions of interest. For example, for chlorinated ethenes, dehalococoides is the magic microbe. It's the only microbe referenced in literature that completely degrades PCE and TCT to the innocuous end products ethene and ethane. For DHC, there's even target abundance that's been identified of 1 × 10⁴ cells per milliliter. Target abundance correlates to rapid degradation rates. That target abundance is referenced in the 2015 He et al. Article in Groundwater Monitoring Remediation. The article also has great content on abiotic degradation by reactive iron minerals, and I urge everyone to pull that and review it. Finally, there's empirical data like macronutrients and their oxidized and reduced products. Macronutrients are the electron acceptors like dissolved oxygen, nitrate, sulfate to stimulate petroleum degradation, or contaminants that are used as serve as electron donors. Electron donors are microbial food that are added to stimulate halorespiration of cometabolic degradation pathways. These microbes breathe the contaminants and need something to eat, and the electron donors are what they eat. The macronutrients also stimulate ancillary geochemical changes that often have empirical relationships with the targeted degradation pathway. For example, ORP, pH, conductivity, alkalinity. These are great data for assessing delivery efficiency. So monitoring is important, and traditional bioremediation performance monitoring heavily relies on seeing direct evidence like VOC concentration reductions. But we just discussed how activated carbon removes VOCs from the aqueous phase. What do we do to monitor and apply? What are we supposed to monitor and apply, like Mann-Kendall statistical analysis is on that? Well, not all of the products and reactants are sorbed by activated carbon. Here's a guidance on treating VOCs using activated carbon. There's a lot of EPA guidance on activated carbon. Even though it's from the 80s, it's still relevant if you want to take deeper dive into the subject. But on page 75 of this guidance has a nice summary of adsorption capacities of select VOCs on activated carbon. The graph at the top of the page shows average sorption capacity using 8 types of activated carbon. For several of the VOCs, basically how much VOC mass is sorbed when the aqueous phase is held at a fixed VOC concentration. You can see the difference. VOCs have different affinities for the activated carbon. Generally, sorption capacities for less soluble compounds are greater than those for more soluble compounds. The graph shows chlorobenzenes and PCE on the right with the highest activated carbon capacities. TCE and benzene are in the middle, and dichloroethene methylene chloride is to the left. Not shown is vinyl chloride, which we plot even further to the left. Ethane and ethene basically have no affinity for activated carbon. Different electron donors could also be plotted here too. Some have higher affinities for activated carbon, and some have very low affinities. The REGENESIS technical people can help you determine whether or not the donors that you want to use have affinity for the activated carbon on PlumeStop. Many of the reactants and products don't have much affinity to activated carbon. You know, chloride, ethane, ethene, there are many others. Microbial parameters also are not very sensitive to activated carbon as far as their relationship with abundances are concerned. Yeah, so last year I gave a talk about engineered bio plus biogeochemical reductive dechlorination combined remedy. It was a pilot test at a site in Arkansas. We also conducted a PlumeStop pilot test at the site that we'll talk about today. Here's a quick refresher on the site. It's a former manufacturing site that began operation in the early 60s. Operations included chlorinated solvents, contaminants included TCE and its daughters. Affected groundwater is present in fractured sandstone matrix where back diffusion is a major concern. We expect long-term back diffusion from this matrix. The sandstone fracture network is predominantly horizontal fracture pattern with some high angle fractures present. And the Vadose zone source areas have been remediated and vapor mitigation systems have been installed. This cross section shows the site conceptual model with the former facility at the top of the hill. The pilot test area is a few hundred feet down gradient of the facility. Excuse me, have a bit of a cold. The plumes discharging to the a local stream about 1,000 feet away from the facility, and the Vadose zone sources have been excavated. The pilot tests were conducted in these adjacent areas. Wells within each oval were included within the performance monitoring. This includes near field wells and far field wells hundreds of feet away from the injection point. The purpose of the pilot tests were to place long-lasting amendments to address back diffusion, exactly as was shown earlier in the back diffusion slides. The overall concept would be to install injection wells along several transects perpendicular to groundwater flow and maintain a treatment conditions every few years with operation and maintenance injections. For PlumeStop plus bio, this would involve injecting biostimulants only during the operation and maintenance activities as the activated carbon is conserved. Cost-wise, the capital cost of installing injection wells in the first application of the PlumeStop and bioremediation amendments is roughly equivalent to the capital cost of a pump and treat system. But the O&M cost of the PlumeStop plus bio, the periodic application of biostimulants, is just a fraction of the cost of pump and treat O&M. And over the lifetime of the remedy, this provides a huge cost savings as compared to pump and treat and a much, much lower total cost to closure. Here's the layout of the near field wells. The distances are labeled in the figure. IW2 was the injection well. It was a 2-inch PVC well screened across the sandstone unit. The amendments included PlumeStop, activated carbon, to sorb VOCs from the aqueous phase and concentrate them for the efficient treatment by biodegradation along the sequential dehalogenation or hydrogenolysis pathway. HRC and HRC primer were the electron donors we used. We also applied micronutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. We added a sodium bicarbonate buffer to keep the pH within the ideal range of dehalogenating microbes. And we actually added some dehalogenating microbes with a dehalococoides augment. The injections went very smoothly. We applied about 5,000 gallons of fluids at less than 10 psi through IW2 and achieved a flow rate of about 10 gallons per minute. There were no delivery issues at all with the amendment. The PlumeStop went in like water. The footprint of the electron donor distribution and the expected geochemical changes in response to the amendment are shown here. The heat map shows 2 post-injection monitoring rounds. The green, strong geochemical shifts, yellow are for moderate, and red for really no shift at all as compared to baseline. For example, the VFAs, in the top row, a measure of electron donor is green, a strong signal in the groundwater samples collected from the closest monitoring wells, and a bit weaker further down gradient. Dissolved oxygen showed a good geochemical response in all wells initially, but you can see some potential influence of DO loading from upgradient untreated areas. Overall, there was a strong geochemical shift, consistent with the pathway we're trying to stimulate in the closest wells. And there's even some evidence of geochemical shifts in amendment delivery in the more distant wells. This slide shows groundwater VOC data and mole fraction information. The x-axis on the plot show the dates of the baseline of performance monitoring sampling. The y-axis is the total VOC and micromolar concentration. And the mole fraction is shown in the pie chart that plots the total VOC concentration. Red's TCE, yellow DCE, greens for vinyl chloride, and blue is ethane and ethene. So you can see that samples in the 3 closest wells, IW2, OW5, and MW6, the wells within 50 feet of the injection point, show significant groundwater concentration decreases with treatment. But apparent progress along sequential reductive dechlorination pathway, seen in the pie charts, is not totally clear because preferential sorption of TCE over, over DCE by the reactive carbon could have caused that partitioning. However, the MW6 pie chart shows 30% conversion of chlorinated VOCs to ethane and ethene. The degradation pathway is definitively complete based on the OW6 samples. MW6 samples. By contrast, the mole fractions didn't change much in OW6 and OW7 samples, but it looks like there might have been some sorption in the OW6 samples. To see what was going on in the sorb phase, we constructed in situ microcosms. In situ microcosms, ISMs, and deployed them before the amendment injection, so that the ISMs would be treated in a manner similar to the fractured sandstone matrix. Here are some photos of the ISMs. We crushed sandstone with a hammer and collected the sand that passed through a 35 mesh sieve, but was retained by a 5 mesh sieve. The crushed sandstone was then placed into 1-inch diameter well screen and deployed within our monitoring wells. We deployed several ISMs into each well so they could be collected discreetly. The goal of the ISM samplers was to quantify degradation on the PlumeStop or on the sorb phase. This slide shows the results of the sorb phase data from the ISMs. The VOC data and mole fraction data are plotted the same way they were on the previous slide. The plots for OW5 and MW6 data show increased VOC mass loading. This is to be expected with upgradient VOC migrating into the treatment area. This was a relatively small pilot test in a much larger area. So even so, the mole fraction data from samples collected in these wells show reduction of TCE to DCE. This information could not be readily inferred from the groundwater sampling data because of the differing affinities of these compounds for the activated carbon. The data from downgradient well OW6 shows significant total VOC concentration decrease and reduction of TCE to DCE. We also ran some advanced diagnostics. Here are the data from MW6, located about 50 feet from the injection point. A fairly representative well as far as being located far enough down gradient to minimize effects of upgradient loading of DO and VOCs, but not so far down gradient that delivery efficiency is questionable. The first 2 plots are the groundwater and ISM sorb plots that we just discussed. Together these plots show partitioning from the aqueous phase of the baseline to the sorb phase following treatment. They also show TCE reduction in the sorb phase, TCE to DCE, and DCE to ethane and ethene in the aqueous phase. The third plot is qPCR groundwater data. The abundance of D. halichocoides is greater than the 10 to the 4th cells per mil threshold that we mentioned earlier. D. halichocoides are obligate respirers of chlorinated VOCs. They would not be present at these elevated abundances if they weren't breathing. The final plot is CSIA data from the ISMs. I'm sure many of you are knowledgeable about CSIA, but I'll make sure everyone's on board, and I'll give a quick review that doesn't involve some eye-boring equations. I delivered this CSIA explanation around a great information I found, a great image that I found online. I'm not sure the explanation will be any better than traditional way CSIA is explained, but at least I got the image into the webinar. I'll count that as a success. So isotopes are a form of the same element that contain an equal number of protons but differ in the number of neutrons. So they differ in atomic mass. The plot shows the isotopes of all elements on the periodic table with the atomic number, the number of protons on the x-axis, and the number of neutrons on the y-axis. The color scale shows stability of each isotope, with black being the most stable, non-radioactive. CSIA measures the abundance of stable isotopes of the elements that comprise compounds of, or are contaminants of interest. The figure to the right shows isotopes of elements that comprise the most chemicals of interest to remediation professionals. We can see from the figure that carbon, for example, has 2 stable isotopes with atomic mass of 12 and 13. Carbon-14 is radioactive and not involved in typical environmental CSIA diagnostics. It's often used for carbon dating organic compounds, and it's even used in the environmental field for rate determining assays, but these are topics for another webinar. The relevance is that chemical bonds of lighter isotopes are slightly more reactive than bonds involving heavier isotopes. So the compounds with the heavier isotopes tend to accumulate in residual matrix. This is referred to as fractionation and is definitive evidence of destructive processes versus non-destructive processes that don't have similar isotopic effects. Here's a slide for the visual learners. The Erlenmeyer flasks represent samples collected from an M&M tray at a party. They're arranged in order in which they were collected, with the left sample being collected before the party and the far right at the end of the party. In the first Erlenmeyer, you can see, out of the package, there are a lot more blue M&Ms. Call them the lighter isotopes than the yellow M&Ms. Call them the heavier isotopes. Everyone knows that blue M&Ms taste much better than yellow M&Ms, so they are preferentially consumed or eaten by guests, increasing the ratio of yellow to blue or heavy to light isotopes. So if during the party we're given a sample, we can compare the initial out-of-the-bag ratio of yellow to blue M&Ms to the M&M ratio in the sample. If the ratio is greater in the sample, then we know the M&Ms are being eaten. Same thing with isotopes. If the ratio of heavier to lighter isotopes increases from a previous sample or from a published literature value, then the initial isotopic signature of the manufactured chemical, we know that degradation has occurred. So reporting gets a little confusing for CSIA. CSIA data are expressed in relation to an international standard, DEL, and multiplied by 1,000, represented by the part per mil symbol. For carbon, this often results in a negative DEL 13C value, as the initial international standard, the PD belemite, is set at 0 and has a higher ratio of C13 to C12 than most things that we measure in the environmental field. So things we measure usually have a more negative DEL 13 values. Now the practical part. Here's a plot of CSIA data with time. The DEL values increase from the first value measured. This fractionation is unequivocal proof, of degradation. Here's a non-degrading daughter product added to the plot. The fractionation of the daughter product you see is related to the parent degradation. Bonds that involve C13 are still degrading, just slower, and they add up in the daughter product. Eventually, all the parent is degraded. When this happens, the isotopic signature of the non-degrading daughter will match the initial isotopic signature of the parent. Here we see how complicated CSIA can get with multiple degrading daughter products. But the basics are TCE is fractionating. The isotopic signature of the non-degrading daughter product, the ethene, is approaching the initial isotopic signature of the TCE. And once the isotopic signature of the intermediate daughter is greater than the initial signature of the parent, that is definitive proof of degradation. So let's take a look at CSIA data collected from MW6. The baseline pre-treatment isotopic signatures of TCE and DCE are about the same, minus 26 parts per mil. The round one isotopic signature of TCE is fractionated and shows degradation with lighter signatures than the baseline, about minus 24 parts per mil. The DCE shows a corresponding isotopic depletion. The C12s from the TCE are dumped into the DCE, which increased the C13 to about minus 28 per mil. During the third round, the TCE continued to fractionate to about minus 20 per mil, continued to degrade. And the DCE showed even stronger fractionation or degradation to minus 12 per mil. This is definitive evidence that both the TCE and DCE are degrading. So based on the sorbed total VOC data, there is more DCE present in round 2, but the CSIA data shows definitively that that DCE is degrading. This is consistent with the VOC data where ethane and the dissolved VOC data from the groundwater where ethene and ethane were accumulating. Hopefully at this point, you all see the need to incorporate contaminant degradation with activated carbon-based remedies. The table below is a summary of potential performance monitoring strategies for these combined remedies. Specific analytes will vary with the contaminant and degradation pathway that is being stimulated, but options are always derived from the reactants and products of the pathway. So here are some monitoring strategy guidelines that should help focus the performance monitoring plans for your design. The top half of the table includes strategies for chlorinated solvents, and the bottom half is for petroleum. The data type gets a column of its own to emphasize the preference of direct and mechanistic data. Empirical data is good, especially for delivery efficiency assessment, but I find direct and mechanistic data to be more actionable and lead to quicker implementation of corrective measures and ultimately a more direct path to closure. The diagnostics and the matrix, which are dictated by the affinity activated carbon, get their own columns. So let's march through the table beginning with the macronutrients, the electron donor for the treatment of the chlorinated solvents and the electron acceptors for the petroleum. Potential donor analytes include volatile fatty acid and dissolved organic carbon. Potential acceptor analytes include dissolved oxygen, nitrate, sulfate. These parameters are great indicators to assess, if the stoichiometry of the design is progressing appropriately or per design. A check to see if there will be enough being depleted too quickly to drive all the reactions. So it's a check to make sure you put enough in the design phase. Adding electron donors and acceptors causes geochemical shifts. The list of potential geochemical shifts parameters can include pH, conductivity, alkalinity, reduced electron acceptors, oxidized donor like carbon dioxide, and even microbial groups such as total eubacteria or methanogens. There are many potential analytes to monitor geochemical shifts. Where to monitor the VOCs depends upon compounds. On the compounds you want to monitor. Generally, expect most petroleum compounds and most chlorinated parent compounds to be present in the sorb phase. So ISMs will be needed to monitor these compounds if desired. VOCs in the aqueous phase are generally limited to less soluble, soluble chlorosubstitute VOCs like vinyl chloride. But when combined with CSIA, vinyl chloride fractionation beyond that of the original PCE-TCE isotopic signature provides definitive evidence of degradation pathway from the aqueous phase alone. End products like ethane, ethene, propane, propene are definitive as it gets as far as reductive solvent degradation. End product assessment for petroleum's compounds is usually carbon dioxide. There are some isotopic techniques available that can even tie the carbon that's generated, or the origin of that carbon, to petroleum products. CSIA is appropriate for whatever matrix the compound of interest is located, but care should be taken to make sure the contaminant and biodegradation pathway result in measurable fractionation, also called an enrichment factor. Most do, but some don't. Stable isotope probing is a technique that I haven't mentioned yet. The technique involves labeling contaminant that is an electron donor and tracing the label to cellular components of the attenuating microbes into the dissolved inorganic carbon, the carbon dioxide. So this technique is generally appropriate for petroleum compounds, but not generally appropriate for chlorinated solvents. And because petroleum compounds are typically sorbed, stable isotope probing study is usually done in situ microcosms. For more information on stable isotope probing, you can visit the Microbial Insights website, microbe.com. Finally, microbial diagnostics. Microbial diagnostics provide great information on the facilitator of the bioremediation pathway. On the chlorinated side, abundance of specific microbes like DHC, obligate and complete respirers of chlorinated compounds provide very strong evidence of degradation along the hydrogenolysis pathway. For petroleum, I like to look at reverse transcriptase for enzymes needed for the pathway I'm trying to stimulate. The RNA analysis provides information not only on the genetic capacity or capability of the microbe, but indicates that the microbe's actually making the enzyme. So there are several options to demonstrate biodegradation when using activated carbon plus bio combined remedies. And many of these options involve pre-deploying Africa matrix in situ microcosms. I like direct measurements of VOCs using this technique. It's my favorite method of demonstrating degradation. It's simple, inexpensive, and easy to couple with advanced diagnostics. And there's one more benefit that's it's a great design tool. This plot shows some of the full-scale design radius of influence rationale used for this Arkansas project. There are two things going on in this plot. The percent VOC sorbed following the PlumeStop treatment and the potentiometric surface increase during injections are plotted with distance. Sorb percentage on the left in blue, head increase in orange on the right. The percent VOC sorb was calculated by comparing total VOC, chlorinated VOC data from the aqueous phase to the data from the ISMs, from the sorb phase. The ISM data was, of course, corrected for moisture. The plot shows that a distance of 80 feet, 80% of the VOCs are sorbed. So not only does the ISM data provide, is very useful for demonstrating degradation, it also provides a method of designing a conservative well spacing. So far, the focus is talked on PlumeStop plus bio, so let's add iron to the mix. REGENESIS has applied their particle steric stabilization chemistry to sulfonated ZVI, and WSP was among the first to use it. I was quick to adopt the technology because synergies between the pathways. Here are some iron and bio synergies. First, competitive inhibition between iron reduction and chlorinated VOC reduction. Competing electron acceptors, has been disproven, at least where fermentable substrate concentrations are kept reasonable. Iron improves conditions for DHC by removing concentration known inhibitors like sulfide and TCA. Iron reducers also produce vitamin B12, a necessary covalent for halorespiration. D-alkyl-CoA can't produce this cobalamin on its own. There are more iron biosynergies and case studies are listed in the groundwater monitoring remediation article I mentioned earlier. Back to my PlumeStop plus bio plus ZVI combined remedy experience. The site is not only in Canada, it's in northern Canada. We battled freezing temperatures to perform the treatment last October. Unfortunately, it is only recently thought out in performance monitoring data, which includes aquifer matrix ISMs, aren't in yet. What I can tell you is that the application is in a barrier configuration, 30 meters total. Injections were made in 2 rows with dry point injections made every 3 meters. We got great distribution of the silty sand in the silty sand matrix, and the amendment was present within all monitoring wells within the barrier. The injections were made at very low pressure, probably a maximum of 10 psi. So there's obviously, there's obviously more to come with this, from this data from this site. But the delivery went incredibly well. And I know the chemistry works, so I'm very optimistic that the next data that we get will be favorable. So with that, I want to turn it over to Maureen to go over a little bit more detail in the synergies of using PlumeStop with ZVI.
Great, thank you, Matt. Hey, so everyone out there, send us your questions. I'm going to be wrapping this up pretty quickly. So email some questions. We're going to have some time. I just want to take it back to the big picture for a minute here. When we're looking at remediation strategies and what are some of the considerations like reactivity and persistence, how does ZVI fit into this? We have PlumeStop and bioremediation. What can ZVI do to help us? Well, it can really help in aspects of the reactivity and our ability to have, more rapid degradation and a number of different components. But one thing, just in stepping back on ZVI, it's not that new. It's been around for a long time. I even go back from my own experience, probably 20 some years ago, playing around with ZVI and DDT. But there are things that are new now. And what was different then has been, I think, predominantly the ability to deliver it when you're considering in situ applications. And so now that we have a colloidal ZVI that can be injected under low pressure, it opens up a lot of really new opportunities. So, again, why would I want to think about ZVI? I think number one, I'm just going to skip to this next slide. You're going to hit this abiotic reduction reaction that may help bypass the VC. So we know about that. So that's something that we're familiar with, and I think it can be really beneficial in our PlumeStop applications in that, the VC doesn't have the same sort of isotherm that something like PCE has, so it can help if you're trying to manage degradation products. I think the other point is, as Matt brought out, that there's a lot of synergies and there's a greater deal of understanding or new understanding that's coming about that, in essence, iron makes bio better and bio makes iron better. So the combination of the two creates a situation where you're going to have faster reactions, better mass reduction, and again, that quicker cost to closure. I mean, that's really what we're all going for here. And another point, so what do we have as far as REGENESIS? We have the AquaZVI and the microZVI. What's different? Matt mentioned sulfidation. Why that's important? This is the ability to treat the iron with reduced iron that's going to help with reactions. And what that means is when iron will react with water. Now there's some benefits to that. It's going to create hydrogen, and that helps with your biological processes. But if you want to have some additional persistence, the sulfidation is going to help with that. It also allows for more selectivity. So you're going to be more selective to treat in the TCE versus just reacting with the water. For more information on that, go to our webinar page, go to our page in REGENESIS, look for Dr. John Freem's webinar. He'll get into some detail on that. So anyway, and so micro ZVI, that's our ZVI that again is colloidal. That's going to be in a glycerol. That's a product that we're going to use, and we're going to mix with other ERD reagents. So you can use with PlumeStop, you can use with an ERD reagent. And again, the big point here is these materials can be suspended versus other ZVI materials and can be distributed like PlumeStop. And I'm just going to move on here. It's going to move like PlumeStop, and it's going to allow you to get that distribution, and that's what's a little different. So with that, I wanted to try to see what kind of questions we have here and see if we can help answer answer your questions. But really, thank you very much for your time. You know, there's more information coming on sites that we have PlumeStop and ZVI, and you know, watch our website. I have several projects that went in just in the Q4 last year. Data are coming in. We're seeing rapid reductions. I'm a big fan of including the ZVI, you know, with the PlumeStop and the bio amendments, because we're getting more rapid reductions in the cost with that. We can often adjust the reagent mixtures, and it may not be that much of an increase in cost because we have software and our ability to design these by looking at isotherms and degradation rates and try to come up with the most efficient way to deal with your site and meet those objectives. So Dane, I don't know if you have any questions here that look good.
Okay. Yes, thanks, Maureen. We do have some questions. We have a little bit of time to get to some of them. So just that's going to conclude the formal section of our presentation. And before we get into the questions, just a couple of reminders. First, you're going to receive a follow-up email with a brief survey. We really appreciate your feedback. So please do take a moment to let us know how we did. Also, right after the webinar, you'll receive a link to the recording as soon as it is available. Okay, so we do have a lot of questions. If we don't get to your question before time runs out, we will make an effort to follow up with you after the webinar. Okay, so let's see here. Getting a couple of questions about PlumeStop. Are there any long-term studies with PlumeStop? Will it break down and re-release contaminants?
Hey, Dane, this is Matt Burns. So activated carbon has been used for an awfully long time, and what affects it and the isotherms are very, very well defined. So the things to watch out for with the application of PlumeStop is to realize that activated carbon has a finite capacity, and having a co-applied or combined remedy that includes a degradation mechanism to keep the carbon clean, to keep those sorption sites available and from reaching its capacity is incredibly important. And monitoring to make sure you have the degradation pathway is also incredibly important.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. Next question is, can you reapply degradation products without adding more PlumeStop if contaminants persist?
Yes, and for that Arkansas site, that is the basis of our design. So the PlumeStop, of course, costs more than just adding the biostimulants alone, which are relatively cheap. So the O&M plan for the Arkansas site is to no longer add any more PlumeStop. The PlumeStop was added initially as part of the capital costs, the initial implementation. So every few years, we expect that we're going to have to go out and add more biostimulant, maybe some micronutrients. So definitely do not need to add more PlumeStop once it's already applied. That activated carbon's there, and you just need to keep it clean by stimulating the degradation mechanism.
Okay, next question is a two-part question. It is, does the biodegradation occur on the dissolved phase only? And then, is the sorbed phase not bioavailable?
Well, I guess that's how small or large you want to draw your black box. So my microbiologist friends tell me that you cannot get degradation on the sorbed phase, like something that's in the solid phase. But there's lots of stuff that go on at very, very, very close distances, that's a technically dissolved but associated with the sorbed phase. So I've noted bioGAC and degradation on activated carbon, where activated carbon is completed, is incredibly efficient. And I think there's a decent amount of studies that show that. And more information on the enhancements of activated carbon on degradation, you check out that webinar that Dora Taggart gave that's archived on the REGENESIS website.
Okay, great.
So I draw my black box pretty large when it comes to that. I don't get caught up in the semantics of does degradation actually occur on the sorb surface or not. It occurs.
Okay, excellent. All right, so maybe time for one more question. Would PlumeStop and AquaZVI work on a low-level 1,1 DCE and vinyl chloride plume?
Sure. Yeah, as long as there's no inhibitors and that sort of thing. So you need to do your normal design homework and make sure you're designing your amendment formulation perfectly. But do you have anything to add to that one, Maureen?
Yeah, and I think, it's important to note, as I mentioned, we have software that allows us to incorporate, isotherms of different chemicals, biodegradation rates, and that, again, will allow us to come up with the right design mixture. Personally, for the compounds that you're mentioning, I certainly would consider a ZVI AquaZVI PlumeStop application, and I think it would be, quite appropriate.
Okay, great. So we are out of time. Thank you so much, Matt and Maureen. That's going to be the end of our chat questions. So if we did not get to your question, someone will make an effort to follow up with you. If you would like more information about engineering solutions from WSP, please visit WSP.com. If you need immediate assistance with a remediation solution from REGENESIS, please visit REGENESIS.com to find your local technical representative, and they will be happy to speak with you. Thanks again very much to Matt Burns and Maureen Dooley, and thanks to everyone who could join us. Have a great day.